Good afternoon. Thank you to our witnesses for being here today. I'd also like to thank the members who have sponsored bills on today's agenda who will be joining us. Before we proceed further, I ask unanimous consent for Representatives Greg Landsman, Chairwoman Elise Stefanik, Representative Scott Franklin, and Representative David Valdeo to participate in this hearing. The purpose of this hearing is to learn from stakeholders with expertise on each of these proposals so that we can make informed decisions about whether to move this legislation forward to improve the delivery of services at the VA. The invaluable insight provided by these members, stakeholders, and agencies is essential to the work of this subcommittee. In today's hearing, we will examine a variety of bills, including bills that impact the VA's accessibility, pay, and accountability. The agenda includes the Veterans Scam and Fraud Evasion Act, sponsored by Chairwoman Stefanik, which would codify an office much needed to fight against scammers who target veterans. The VA Correct Compensation Act, sponsored by Ranking Member Takano, which would attempt to ensure bureaucracy does not get in the way of paying medical professionals what they are legally owed. The Veterans Accessibility Advisory Committee Act, sponsored by Representative Valdeo, which would ensure veterans with disabilities have a seat at the decision-making table. And the VA Political Performance Disclosure Act, sponsored by General Bergman, which would ensure our committee has full oversight of VA political appointee performance. I'm eager to hear more from our members and witnesses about these bills, and I want to thank our witnesses again for being here today, and I look forward to our discussion. Now I recognize Ranking Member Mervan for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Chair Kiggins. I am pleased that the subcommittee is considering several pieces of key legislation that will take steps towards ensuring that the VA workforce is supported and has the tools they need to provide world-class care to our veterans. Today we are considering H.R. 6538, the VA Correct Compensation Act of 2023, a bill championed by Ranking Member and full committee Congressman Takano. I'm proud to co-sponsor this important piece of bipartisan legislation. This bill protects Title 38 VA employees' right to collectively bargain over issues with their pay. For instance, currently, if a Title 38 VA nurse works overtime and that overtime is not reflected on their pay stub, the VA can limit that nurse's ability to grieve that error through the bargaining unit. The VA Correct Compensation Act is a critical tool to help with employee retention, so employees know they have the path to be made whole when there is an issue with their compensation. For years, we have been hearing from Title 38 nurses and other critical medical center staff about how they are denied the collective bargaining rights that their federal healthcare worker counterparts are afforded under the law. Last Congress, we came together to pass the VA Employees Fairness Act out of the House of Representatives. That bill addresses the limits the Secretary's authority to deny collective bargaining and grievances right for Title 38 VA medical professionals, including the employees who care for our veterans every day, like RNs and CRNAs, physicians and physician assistants, dentists, and more. Currently, these frontline employees are prevented from raising grievances about issues such as professional training and patient safety policies that undermine patient care. There are still substantive policy disagreements among members of Congress as to fixing this issue, but I look forward to working with Ranking Member Takano to reintroduce the VA Employee Fairness Act soon and restore full collective bargaining rights for the VA Title 38 healthcare professionals. In the meantime, the VA Correct Compensation Act is an opportunity to make a bipartisan, meaningful impact on union rights for VA medical professionals in the near term. What the VA Correct Compensation Act does is simple, but incredibly important. This bill ensures there is a fair process Title 38 VA employees can access to make them whole when there is an error in their pay. I appreciate the work done thus far from our union partners on this bill, as well as the support of the VSOs. This bill is endorsed by the Service Employees International Union, National Federation of Federal Employees, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees, the American Association of Nurse, and the Senior Executive Association. I would like to specifically thank the American Federation of Government Employees, or the AFGE, for their support and continued partnership with our committee to bring us issues and solutions to those issues the VA employees face. I would like to extend a warm welcome to Ms. Jocelyn Westbrook, who is representing the AFGE today. Ms. Westbrook has served as a registered nurse for the VA for 40 years. Thank you for caring for our veterans. Thank you for advocating for your fellow VA staff, and thank you for being here. Throughout the AFGE's testimony, we will hear that unfortunately, errors in employee pay at the VA is a common problem and one that has affected far too many of their dedicated health professionals. In many instances, VA has miscalculated or failed to pay staff for overtime, holiday work, or weekend shifts. In some cases, it has taken months for VA to get those employees the pay they have earned and have rightly owed. It is easy to imagine how errors in pay can affect an employee's livelihood and their morale. The VA Correct Compensation Act rectifies this inequity, and I hope to see it advance through this committee as soon as possible. I'm also glad we are considering H.R. 6531, the Train VA Employees Act, introduced by former chairman of this subcommittee, Representative Pappas. This bill would improve the substandardized management training to all levels of supervisors and executives across VA. One of the core deficiencies my staff identified throughout this committee's investigation into sexual harassment at VA. I'm proud to co-sponsor the Train VA Employees Act and look forward to improving the text based on some of the testimony we received for this hearing. This committee has always held VA to the highest standard for the quality of care of veterans and should receive. We must also push VA to provide these same standards for the quality of work of the workforce and environment of the workplace. VA employees, many of whom are veterans as well, deserve these rights and resources. The VA Correct Compensation Act and the Train VA Employees Act are steps in the right direction. As our recent joint VSO hearings highlighted, education is a vital step in ensuring veterans and their families are aware of the resources available to them at the VA. The Veterans Affairs Centennial and Heritage Act of 2024, H.R. 6947, is a step in the right direction as it creates a VA History Office in Dayton, Ohio. This bipartisan bill is co-sponsored by my committee colleague, Representative Greg Landsman, and would provide an outlet to recognize the critical work of VA and its employees over the last 100 years. I want to mention my concerns with H.R. 7734, the Required Notation, Investigation, and Personnel File Act. This bill would completely evade due process by requiring VA to annotate the personal paperwork for employees who resign from their position amid an investigation before the investigation concludes and findings are made. By statute, VA is already required, as all federal agencies, to permanently annotate a former employee's personnel file if that person leaves their position while under investigation and that investigation results in adverse findings. The current U.S. Code also affords these former employees appeal rights, as due process requires. It is unclear to me why this bill takes such an extreme approach that would duplicate existing law and add language that would likely result in years of litigation. Chair Kiggins, I hope our staffs can work together to address policy concerns with these pieces of legislation. I hope we can advance the other bipartisan bills we will consider today. I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Mervan. Before we get to testimony, I will introduce the witnesses on today's panel. On today's panel, representing the Department of Veteran Affairs, we have Mr. John Borsler, VA's Chief Veterans Experience Officer. He is accompanied by Ms. Tracy Thurett, VA's Chief Human Capital Officer, Mr. David Perry, Chief Officer for Workforce Management and Consulting within the VA's Veteran Health Administration, and Mr. Charles Worthington, Chief Technology Officer for the VA's Office of Information Technology. Also on our panel, representing the American Federation of Government Employees, we have registered nurse Jocelyn Westbrooks, who is both the Secretary and Treasurer for AFG Local 1633. I'll ask the witnesses on our panel to please stand and raise your right hand to be sworn in. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to provide is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? Thank you. Let the record reflect that all witnesses answered in the affirmative. You may be seated. Mr. Borsler, we will start with you. You are recognized for 5 minutes to provide your testimony.
Well, good afternoon and howdy. Thank you, Chairwoman Higgins, Ranking Member Mervan, and members of the committee. I appreciate the opportunity to represent the Department of Veterans Affairs and appear before you today to discuss these 9 bills. I am accompanied today by Ms. Tracy Thurett, Chief Human Capital Officer, Human Resources and Administration, Operations, Security, and Preparedness, Mr. David Perry, Chief Officer, Workforce Management and Consulting, Veterans Health Administration, and Mr. Charles Worthington, Chief Technology Officer, Office of Information Technology. We have provided detailed comments in the full testimony to include areas of support and concern, noting certain provisions that could benefit from some clarification or amendment. We are thankful for your time today and look forward to working with the committee on these important bills. VA supports H.R. 6452 with amendments and subject to the availability of appropriations. This bill complements the Veterans Scam and Fraud Evasion, or VSAFE, Task Force, an administration initiative, which is an administration initiative launched in December of 2023. Our suggested amendment would support standing up a VSAFE office versus the creation of just one VSAFE officer billet. In line with H.R. 6452, VA announced our fiscal year 25 legislative proposal that seeks to codify the larger Veterans Experience Office, otherwise known as VEO, within which the VSAFE program operates. Codifying VEO permanently within statute would ensure that the veteran has a voice in policy formation and decision-making process permanently. VA supports H.R. 6531, the Trained VA Employees Act, subject to amendments and availability of appropriations. VA cites concerns with H.R. 6538, the VA Correct Compensation Act of 2023, but would be happy to work with the committee on an alternative approach that would require VA to establish an internal process whereby Title 38 employees could pursue allegations of compensation errors in violation of the law, rule, regulation, or policy outside the scope of collective bargaining. VA appreciates the intent of H.R. 6874, the VA Web Act, but cites concerns. While VA supports the intent of this bill, we believe that many performance accountability mechanisms are in place already, and that the types of system monitoring required by the bill are a natural part of software development. We are concerned with the implications of some of the bill's definitions and reporting requirements, which are discussed further in our written testimony. VA supports H.R. 6947, subject to the availability of appropriations. This bill would codify VA's establishment of a history office and provide clear authorities in statute that advance VA's effort to preserve its history formally through this office. VA does not support H.R. 7342, the Veterans Accessibility Advisory Committee Act of 2024. We believe this effort is duplicative of the efforts of numerous existing VA advisory committees. VA would welcome the opportunity to work with the committee to determine how we would address Congress's underlying concerns in the existing federal advisory committees. VA supports the draft VA Medical Center Weapons Detection Technology Bill, which would authorize the Secretary to carry out a pilot program to use weapon detection technology at the primary entrance of VA medical centers, subject to the availability of appropriation. The VA supports the draft required notation of Investigation and Personnel Record File Act if amended and subject to appropriations. The bill would require a notation in the personnel record file of VA employees who resign from government employment prior to the resolution of associated personnel investigation. Our suggested amendments would seek to clarify and conform which employees are covered by the bill and to ensure that required due process and appeal rights are afforded. Lastly, VA does not support the draft Reporting Performance Plans for VA Political Appointees Act, which would require the blanket submission of political appointee performance plans. VA administers a performance management system that holds all political appointees accountable for individual and organizational performance. We are concerned with this bill's exclusive focus on political appointees, as well as the challenge of balancing accountability with the confidentiality of personnel records, but we welcome the ability to have further discussions with Congress to meet your needs while balancing these requirements. The Department of Veterans Affairs remains steadfast in our commitment to keep veterans and their families at the center of everything we do. Thank you all for the opportunity to discuss the legislation before the committee. We look forward to working with you and to addressing any questions you may have.
Thank you, Mr. Boisler. The written statement of Mr. Boisler will be entered into the hearing record. Ms. Westbrooks, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to provide your testimony.
Van and members of the subcommittee, thank you for inviting AFGE to today's hearing. My name is Joycelyn Westbrooks, and I'm the Secretary-Treasurer for AFGE Local 1633 at the Michael E. DeBakey VA Medical Center in Houston, Texas. For the past 40 years, I have had the honor of serving our nation's veterans as a registered nurse at the VA, the nation's best healthcare system. On behalf of AFGE and its National VA Council, representing over 300,000 VA employees, including 75,000 Title 38 employees, I am here today to strongly endorse H.R. 6538, the VA Correct Compensation Act, or VACA. This bipartisan bill is also endorsed by our sister unions, NEFI, SEIU, and AFSCME, as well as the nurse anesthetists and our VSO partners, DAV, PVA, and the American Legion. The legislation will limit the agency's power to deny grievances challenging routine payroll errors affecting Title 38 clinicians. Since the enactment of 7422 in 1991, the VA has used its authority to deny grievances related to the establishment, determination, or adjustment of employee compensation. For years, this committee has examined ways to amend 7422, including the VA Employee Fairness Act. I raised this bill because through spirited debate, a consensus emerged that the VA has misused its authority under 7422 to routinely not pay payroll errors. Chairman Bost and Ranking Member Takano have built on that common ground and crafted a bill that we can enact this Congress. The fruit of that labor is VACA, a technical correction to the 7422 statute that defines the compensation exception in 7422 and explicitly prevents the VA from denying grievances contesting that a covered employee has received the correct compensation as required by law, rule, regulation, or binding agreement. This common sense bill will allow employees to file a grievance and have a fair process to make themselves whole. Unfortunately, payroll errors are a common problem at the VA. Too often, the VA fails to accurately calculate if a covered employee worked overtime, the night shift, weekend shift, or holiday. If the affected employee is a Title 38 hybrid, that employee could easily file a grievance and receive the money they're owed under the law. However, if an employee is a pure Title 38 employee, the VA threatens and does invoke 7422 to deny the grievance, with the employee losing the ability to receive the compensation they are rightfully owed. In practice, that means that an RN does not have the same rights as an LPN, an optometrist does not have the same rights as an audiologist, and a psychiatrist does not have the same rights as a psychologist. Beyond this inequality, over 30 years, the VA's use of this authority has discouraged employees from even filing grievances to correct their pay, and that harms retention. A clear example of this arises from the Asheville, North Carolina VA, where the AFGE filed a grievance on behalf of the nurses, claiming the VA failed to pay the nurses' night differential and weekend pay. An arbitrator ruled in favor of AFGE, but the VA refused to pay, citing 7422. The Undersecretary for Health reaffirmed its use of 7422, denying the grievance. In 2007, the VA failed to accurately pay for overtime in Buffalo, New York. The VA chose nurse practitioners to work 8 Saturdays to address a backlog. That year, UAN and NNU filed a grievance alleging that management owed the employees Saturday premium pay in addition to the overtime pay. The VA invoked 7422, denying the grievances. Beyond these examples, I want to share that while this bill hits home for me, my dad was a decorated Army veteran. He passed away at 52 from cancer. My family and I forever appreciate the VA for the instrumental part it played in his final days. When my dad needed more intensive care than could be provided locally, the VA airlifted him to a regional hospital to receive that care. Those nurses and doctors who cared for him are our sheroes and heroes. Title 38 staff in VA hospitals across America are answering the call for so many families and meeting the demands and needs of our veterans. We have a basic responsibility to correctly compensate these providers as we do other staff. Congress never intended for 7422 to permit the VA to deny grievances over routine payroll errors and unlawfully without the compensation due to its employees. When I grew up, you pay people what they're owed for an honest day's work. This is not Democratic or Republican, but American, and not complicated, but common sense. By passing the VA Correct Compensation Act, Congress can prevent problems and force the VA to pay Title 38 clinicians what they're owed under law. Thank you, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you, Ms. Westbrooks. The written statement of Mrs. Westbrooks will be entered into the hearing record. We will now turn to questions, and I yield Chairwoman Stefanik 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Kiggins, for the opportunity to join the VA committee today for this important legislative hearing. And while I do not serve on this committee, this hearing, as all VA hearings, are critical for veterans both across my district in New York 21, home to the largest number of veterans in New York State, and across this country. My bill is one of the bills under discussion today, and it addresses a matter that affects all of our nation's veterans: the rise of fraud and scams targeting those who have bravely served our country. The statistics are staggering, and we've worked with many constituents who have faced these frauds and scams. According to the FTC, over 74,000 military retirees and veterans reported instances of fraud or identity theft in 2023 alone, resulting in a collective loss of $350 million hard-earned dollars. These scams came in various forms, including fake debt collectors, credit card fraud, benefits fraud, and fake job opportunities, just to name a few. Criminals often exploit veterans' trust by impersonating government officials or representatives of well-known financial institutions, making it difficult for our veterans to discern the truth from deceit. We must act to better protect our veterans against these malicious actors. That is why I introduced the bipartisan Veteran Scam and Fraud Evasion Act, known as the VSAFE Act, and I appreciate those supportive comments, Mr. Borsler. This significant bill aims to permanently establish an office within the VA dedicated to leading all fraud prevention efforts. Currently, the VA lacks a centralized approach codified in law to combat fraud, with various offices operating in a decentralized manner. My VSAFE Act bill will rectify this by providing oversight and coordination of all fraud prevention efforts within the VA, ensuring these activities are coordinated across the entire department. My bipartisan bill, H.R. 6452, the VSAFE Act, represents a crucial step towards safeguarding our nation's veterans from fraudulent activities. By codifying into law a dedicated organization within the VA and fostering collaboration across government agencies, we can and we will better protect those who have sacrificed so much for our country. I thank the chair for holding this hearing, and I urge my colleagues to support this bipartisan bill as we work it through the legislative process, through the committee and on the floor. My question is for you, Mr. Borsler. Can you tell me why the VSAFE Act that I've introduced, why it's important to have a one-stop shop for veterans where they can go to in times of crisis as they are facing this unprecedented threat of frauds and scams?
Well, yes, and thank you, Congresswoman, for your support and for introducing the bill. I think it's incredibly important, and for many different reasons. And the $350 million metric you mentioned a second ago, that's just what has gone reported. We have no idea how many more millions have impacted our military, our veterans, and their families. So we do need a centralized effort here, not only within the Department of Veterans Affairs, but within the broader federal landscape, because there are many different agencies that have enforcement authorities and reporting authorities, and we want that one central phone number for veterans and their families to call, one website to go to, so that they can not only identify ways to protect themselves against different scam and fraud efforts, but also report these efforts so that we can track them down and prevent it from happening to other veterans and families.
Well, thank you. Thank you for your support of the legislation. I know you have some recommendations from the VA. We look forward to working with you on some of those recommendations as we move this process forward. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Chairwoman Stefanik. I will now yield myself 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Borsler, this question is for you. As a geriatric nurse practitioner, it wasn't uncommon for me to hear about patients and veterans who were targeted by fraudsters, and it was very stressful for these guys. They had a hard time using computers anyway, or using their phones or tablets, and when they were victim to either a phone call or something that appeared on their computer, it was very stressful and oftentimes resulted in the loss of a lot of money and an invasion of their privacy. So how will the VSAFE office, which I am very excited about and very supportive of, specifically combat fraud against older veterans? And how will you be able to get that message of what you're offering in that office, to your patients and to our veterans?
Well, thank you, Chairwoman, and especially our elderly veterans and their families are being specifically targeted by many of these predatory actors, and we've identified many different types of pension poaching or identity theft or romance schemes that have been specifically targeting them. And what we're planning to do and what we are already doing is not only identifying which offices can provide more information to these individuals, but more specifically reach out in the channels that are available to us via letter, via phone call, via text message, via email, however we can get it in the hands of our veterans and their caregivers and families. It's critically important that they know not only, as I mentioned a second ago, how to identify these types of scam and predatory actors and attempts, but where to report, to which federal agency has jurisdiction. And they shouldn't have to figure that out themselves. We should make it much easier for them. So I think the VA and having va.gov especially as a trusted website that veterans already go to, and 1-800-MY-VA-411 is a trusted number for veterans to call and their families to call. We want to be that coordination entity and help our federal partners in engaging and protecting more veterans.
Thank you. So a good PR campaign and enlisting local media, and let us know how we can help spread that word so they know that resource is available to them too. So for me, living in the Commonwealth of Virginia and representing Virginia Beach, we have so much great history, especially in the Commonwealth. And I'm a history buff. I'm also the wife of an Ohio Navy veteran. So I'm very excited the VA is planning to preserve our nation's history in Ohio. Mr. Borsler, how does the VA's History Office plan to collect and preserve artifacts?
Well, we've done a tremendous amount in the past many years of collecting and preserving artifacts, and I think we have bolstered those efforts with the VA History Office in particular by hiring folks that have these specific skill sets and to really bring it up to par to other federal agencies and their permanent history offices. And I think the fact that the museum itself will be eventually located on campus at the Dayton, Ohio VA Medical Center, and throughout its history as one of the National Soldiers' Homes, is incredibly important. And so the Mike Visconage and the VA History Office team has already done a great job to collect and identify these artifacts, but more importantly, preserve them for future generations of not only veterans, but Americans, and I think it can't be understated how important this is for employee experience, for us as VA employees and the many hundreds of thousands who serve our veterans and families can see themselves reflected in this effort.
Very much so. When I worked at the VA hospital in Hampton, Virginia for a short time, I remember on my lunch break, I would go to the front we had a very old, part of the hospital was a Civil War hospital, and they had a very small, just museum, but it was fascinating to see the pictures and to recognize the different parts of the hospital that were still there and to have that history preserved. So thank you very much for preserving that for us. And Mrs. Thurett, as chairwoman of the subcommittee, I've witnessed instances where VA employees have prioritized politics over serving our veterans. How is the department making sure that political appointees' annual performance plans keep them accountable to the veterans they serve and keeps hyper-partisanship out of serving our veterans?
Chairwoman Higgins, thank you for that question. VA looks forward to working with the committee on the political performance plan bill and making sure that we strengthen the bill to ensure that it reflects the work that we're doing to make sure political appointees as well as career senior executives are held to the same performance standards. So currently we have 38 USC 725. In that bill, we are required to make sure that our Schedule C appointees as well as our political appointees are on performance plans. We use an enterprise-wide performance management IT system to track those plans, to track the evaluations that our careers and our politicals receive. We are also under OPM regulations, the Office of Personnel Management, to have a certified performance management system that meets all the criteria for GS as well as political appointees. So we have a lot of internal controls in place. We are making sure that political appointees are held to the same standards as our career employees. You have two examples sitting in front of you today. Mr. Borsler is a non-career SES. I am a career SES. We go through the same process. Our plans, our end-of-year appraisals go to a performance review board. Then they go to the Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs for approval. So we have internal controls. We follow the guidance from the Office of Personnel Management to make sure that those processes are in place and that they're fair and equitable and everybody is being held accountable. Our concern with the bill as drafted, and we welcome the opportunity to discuss these concerns, is the exclusive focus on political appointees. We want to be able to balance the need for accountability with the need for protecting the confidentiality of these personnel records that are private and sensitive in nature. So we look forward to working with the committee to ensure that the intent and the goals that you have, whether through data, through reports, or other mechanisms, are met by the Department of Veterans Affairs.
Thank you for your comments. My time has expired, and I now yield to Ranking Member Mervan for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. Ms. Therrett or Mr. Perry, thank you for your testimony on the VA Correct Compensation Act, ensuring VA Title 38 employees have access to the same collective bargaining rights as their hybrid VA and other federal agency employee peers is a priority for me. VA's testimony states that you are actively focused on correctly paying employees and plan to seek input from labor partners on a new internal process. Can you please describe what this internal process will be and how it will be different or it will differ from the current grievance procedure for hybrid employees?
Thank you, Representative Mervan, for that question. So the internal process that we're referring to would be a new process to establish a review to allow us to address errors when they do occur. So Title 38, as you mentioned, is covered currently under 7422, which doesn't have that ability now. So this process would be a joint effort that increases the transparency. So when errors do occur that are pay impacting, we have that review process that gets adjudicated to ensure that those corrections do occur. Title 38 hybrids do cover or fall under the GS or the general schedule provisions now, so they do have the ability to grieve errors, which is different than what the Title 38 employees currently have. So this internal process seeks to address that to give more parity along with fixing errors when they do arise.
How does the VA position on the VA Correct Compensation Act square with the statement of the administration policy issued by President Biden in 2022 in support of the VA Employees Fairness Act?
So I think our position on that bill is, again, we seek for the same goal. We do want to make sure that we don't allow errors to occur, and when they do, we get those fixed promptly. I think the legislation that we have in front of us draft, we support the intent, like I mentioned, but we do need some modifications and want to work with the committee on those modifications. As written now, it actually allows for the negotiability and grievance of pay setting and pay change, so when we make changes to rates of pay. So that's different than when errors occur, and so that's what we want to work with the committee on to get those modifications addressed so we get to the intent of what this legislation is seeking to fix, which is the pay errors that need to be corrected.
Just off the cuff, the new process and what you're speaking of, nurses who are working overtime who aren't paid, what does that mean to them as far as the timeline? Even though you have this new process and you use the term promptly, what should they be looking at as far as when that will be corrected and when they'll actually get paid?
Yes, sir, and I think that's where we're looking to work collaboratively with our labor partners to establish what those timelines should be so that it is done expeditiously. I think we want to get them fixed as quickly as possible. As Ms. Westbrook had testified to, we absolutely know that employees deserve to be paid and compensated for the work they've done, and so we want to work collaboratively to set up what that time frame should be to get to the resolution of pay errors.
Okay. Ms. Westbrooks, thank you again for being here today and for your tireless commitment to caring for our nation's veterans as the VA nurse. In recent Congresses, this committee has taken up pieces of legislation that would ensure key bargaining rights to the Title 38 VA medical staff. Some members of this committee have argued that providing these rights would affect patient care. However, I'm glad that many of us on both sides of the aisle agree that the VA medical professionals deserve the pay that they have earned. Can you describe the impact the VA Correct Compensation Act will have on the VA's ability to recruit and retain the best workforce to care for our nation's veterans? And does this issue matter to your membership?
Thank you, Ranking Member, for that question. Mervan, thank you so much. Yes, actually, this is very important to our clinicians, our Title 38 at our VAs. I understand what you're saying about another process, but we're asking that the process be the process that's already in place for the hybrid Title 38s. I have nurses that on board, physicians, physician assistants that on board with the wrong salaries, with They don't get their, for nurses, they don't get their differentials, their holiday pay, their weekend pay. And presently, they don't have the ability to grieve these instances as the hybrid Title 38s. And unfortunately, some will stay. We try to work with the agency to work through them. But the process can be sometimes a year or 2 years getting settled. And because nurses, doctors, physician assistants, chiropractors, podiatrists, they have many, many choices. A lot of times they will not stay. And this is what I say. I've been with the VA a long time, and I believe in its mission. But if we say that we want to take care of America's heroes, then we have to retain the best and the brightest. You will never pay them what they're worth. There is no salary. But they should be paid what they are due. They should be paid what we say that we owe them. And they should not have to fight about it. I understand about doing things expeditiously, but that doesn't happen, unfortunately. And so we lose wonderful staff because of it. And I've seen it over these 40 years, time and time again.
Thank you, Ms. Westbrooks. With that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Mervan. The chair now yields 5 minutes to Representative Rosendale.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman Kiggins, for holding this hearing. During the 118th Congress, in my role as the chairman of the Technology Modernization Subcommittee, we've had 2 hearings on the problems with VA.gov. They were major problems, and we've had to shed light on the negative impacts they have caused for our veterans. In January 2023, the VA notified the Veterans Affairs Committee that roughly 31,000 veterans had been identified whose disability compensation claims submitted to the VA.gov were rejected due to processing errors going back to November of 2018. Worse yet, the website did not notify the veterans of their failed submissions, leaving them in the dark about not receiving their benefits. It's actually quite disappointing that the veterans would wait so long, months, 6 months, year, not even recognizing that their benefits hadn't been registered for because they are so conditioned to having these delays to receive any kind of information, communication, or benefit from the VA. Think about that. That's how conditioned that the veterans have become, and that is disappointing. During the week of August 7th, 2023, approximately 5,600 veterans received an error message on VA.gov that their submissions did not go through. This was the last week for the veterans to submit intents to file under the PACT Act that we had a lot of discussion about earlier today. Upon learning of this, I immediately worked with Secretary McDonough to move back the deadline a week, allowing more veterans to get the retroactive benefits that they deserve. On September the 5th, the VA disclosed that roughly 56,000 veterans' requests to add or remove dependents were not processed, potentially causing them to be underpaid or overpaid going back to 2011, causing major problems in either direction. These errors by the VA are unacceptable and have caused a lot of stress to veterans and their families. Our veterans should not be having difficulty accessing benefits that they've earned because of failures by VA.gov. My bill, H.R. 6874, the Watching Over Electronic Benefits Act, would address these problems by requiring the VA to implement a process to actively monitor the VA.gov website for any adverse events that would impact the facilitation, maintenance, or receipt of the VA benefits. The legislation would ensure that the errors are identified and improve Congress's ability to conduct proper oversight. Additionally, my legislation would require a testing strategy by the VA to reduce the number of adverse events that happen by improving testing for each modification or software update to anything that might impact the facilitation, maintenance, or receipt of the benefits. This would get to the crux of the issue by preventing problems before they occur and create the potential harm for our veterans. We owe it to our nation's heroes to have the VA.gov website that's easy to use and mistake-free. Mr. Worthington, it's good to see you again here today. I'm glad the VA supports the intention of my bill, and I am willing to work with you to refine the definitions and and refine these timeframes to make sure that we can find something that actually works. The testimony provided by the VA states in part, the department has many performance accountability mechanisms in place, but we still have a lot of errors that are going on. Do you think the current mechanisms are adequate, or is there room for improvement helping us to reduce these errors which deny the benefits delivery?
Thank you, Congressman, for the question. And as you know, we definitely agree with you that the errors encountered earlier this year are unacceptable, and we're working hard to make sure that nothing like that would happen again. I think that we would love to work together on refining those definitions. I think that the ability to identify problems is much stronger than it was earlier this year, in part thanks to the oversight work that you all did with us. And I think that the main, as you mentioned, the main concerns we want to work through with you are refining those reporting requirements so that we're really focusing our teams on those most important issues that are really impacting veterans as they were by those earlier incidents.
Okay. So again, definitions to me are critical in any kind of legislation that we develop at all. It really needs to be very objective and refined to the point that everybody understands that they're talking about the same thing. And the time frames, again, I'm willing to work with, but identifying a problem, this time frame should be very, very short. Notification should be very, very short. And then response we have to work on. Thank you very much. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Rosendale. The chair now yields 5 minutes to Representative Landsman.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for this hearing and the opportunity to participate. I want to thank my neighbor and colleague, Representative Mike Turner, who represents the future VA History Center in Dayton. He introduced this legislation on the House side. He's done a lot of work, as you all know, in securing the funding and private sector support to allow the project to succeed. I just wanted to say a few words on behalf of the bill. I also want to thank Senator Sherrod Brown for taking the lead on the Senate side, along with Senator Vance, and for always keeping us organized and working together for Ohio. The Dayton VA is one of 3 historic VAs in the country. It was one of the branches of the National Home for Disabled Veteran Soldiers and is older than the VA itself, the Department of VA. In fact, several of the buildings were actually built by Union War veterans who lived there after the war. Today, the facility serves thousands of veterans on its unique campus, including many of my constituents in Warren County. Many additional constituents of mine travel from the district to work at the Dayton VA campus. Once completed, the History Center will house a VA museum, event center, education center, archives, and research facility. The VA Centennial and Heritage Act would ensure that VA employees, veterans, and their families have access to Southwest Ohio's rich history with the VA for years to come. It's a bipartisan, bicameral bill, and it would establish a Veterans Affairs History Office within the VA to coordinate and build this ongoing effort. The bill gives the Secretary of the VA it also gives the Secretary of the VA the authority to accept gifts and donations and work with nonprofits to help fund the office and carry out its mission. It is my hope that the VA History Center will help educate Americans on the history of the VA and remind them of the importance of delivering for those who have served our country. I also hope that the centralized archives will serve as a helpful resource for veterans and those who have loved ones who served and have enrolled in the VA system. Ultimately, we believe that this will help increase awareness of VA programs and benefits and will help bring more and more veterans into the VA family and bring the VA closer to communities. With that, I just want to say thank you again, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Landsman. The chair now recognizes Representative Franklin for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. My bill, H.R. 7734, requires transparency in how the VA records disciplinary action against retiring or resigning personnel under investigation for inappropriate behavior. Specifically, it directs the VA to make permanent notation of any investigation and its findings in the permanent record of employees. This is especially important in cases involving staff who resign or retire to avoid scrutiny or evade repercussions. In 2016 House Veterans Affairs Committee hearing, this panel discussed a troubling recurring practice at the VA. The VA often enters settlement agreements with resigning employees or those under review for disciplinary actions instead of following established procedures through completion. Between 2014 and 2016, the committee reviewed more than 200 settlements provided by the VA of personnel who resigned while under investigation. Shockingly, in 96% of these settlements, the disciplinary action proposed or taken against the employee did not appear anywhere in their permanent record form. More recently, in September 2023, my colleagues and I learned of allegations of sexual misconduct at the VA by credible whistleblowers who didn't trust the VA's internal investigations process. On November 13th, 45 days after the committee initially contacted Secretary McDonough about these allegations, the alleged perpetrator and staff believed to have knowledge of the incidents were either reassigned by the VA or allowed to retire. It's unacceptable. The VA staff should never be allowed to hide behind settlement agreements, resign, or retire to evade accountability for their misconduct. I fully believe in due process, but the VA is not exercising due process. Cutting deals sweeps potential wrongdoing under the rug. Our veterans and all Americans certainly deserve better than that, and I urge my colleagues to support my bill to close this loophole and hold VA personnel accountable. Thank you, Madam Chair, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Franklin. The chair now yields 5 minutes to Representative Radewagen.
Talofa. Thank you, Chairwoman Kiggins and Ranking Member Mervan, for holding this hearing. Thank you to the panel for your testimony. Mrs. Westbrooks, what challenges and problems do you hear from your members about the management style of their supervisors? And do you believe the workplace culture is dependent on good leaders?
Thank you for that question. Some of the challenges that we face with supervisors and managers is that we need to do more joint trainings, more partnerships, so that everybody understands the master agreement. We're all in congruency with how things are supposed to go, because that makes for a better working atmosphere. At the end of the day, AFGE, as well as the agency, wants the veteran to have the best experience that they can have. And so I believe that we have the same mission. But a lot of times, we get supervisors that are not trained, that don't know anything about the procedures and policies of the VA or the master agreement. And so it creates an atmosphere that does not have to exist, because we're on the same page if we could stay on the same page. But sometimes they don't know where the page is. And so that's where we come into play. And so at Houston, I can tell you, though, our leadership there partners with us. We have a partnership across the board, and then we even have a nursing partnership there. And so we're very proactive, but that's not the case across the nation. And I think a lot of times we get a lot done. Houston is large, we're complex. And so we understand, that there are going to be issues, but we also want to come to the table to resolve the issues as the lowest level possible, and to make sure that the veteran is always the center of what we do. And so that's what I tell the staff. We're going to always do what's best for that patient.
Thank you. Ms. Sterrett, does VA often suspend an investigation when the subject of that investigation resigns or retires? Mr. Franklin talked about that a little bit.
Representative Radewagen, VA supports the bill on annotating personnel records when an individual is during a personnel investigation. We currently are looking at ways that we can work with the committee to strengthen the bill, as well as to look at the legislation, regulations, and statute that's currently on the books. We mentioned 5 U.S.C. 3322, so that's currently in place, and how that works is that when an individual resigns during a pending investigation as defined in the legislation, an annotation is made in their record. We also have mechanisms that the Office of Personnel Management has given us to the question that you mentioned about suspensions. So if a suspension or a removal is proposed, There are ways that an individual's record can be coded with an in lieu of involuntary action coding. So when we look at the bill as it's written, we want to make sure that we clarify the intent and understand how it compares to things that we already have in place or how it adds to those things that we have in place. Some of the ways in which we would identify strengthening the current bill are making sure that it covers hybrid Title 38 employees, making sure that it covers senior executives as written. We also acknowledged that, I think as written, it covers resignations. We also want it to reflect retirements and transfers between
Right.
federal agencies and the due process provisions that are in 5 U.S.C. 3322 as well. We also want to make sure that we're clear in terms of what personnel investigations would fall under the legislation so that we can comply and we can meet the intent of the law with the resources that are needed to be able to do that.
But if ongoing investigations are not annotated in an employee's permanent file, isn't there a risk that the employee could come back to VA or another federal agency a few years after they've resigned or retired?
So I know as a hiring manager, I would want to know that information as I am considering someone for a position. So I think the key is to be able to understand, as Representative Rosendale mentioned earlier, what is the definition of a personnel investigation? What is the expectation of the VA in annotating that record either during the investigation or after an adverse action has been proposed or after somebody leaves the agency? So I think seeking clarification so that we are clear in the law as written and that we can meet those expectations that you and the other members of the committee have.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman. Yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Radewag. And the chair now recognizes Representative Valdeo for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman Kiggins, Ranking Member Mervin, and all members of the subcommittee for your time today. Our veterans sacrifice so much for our nation, and we owe it to them to provide the highest quality of care. Sadly, many of our disabled veterans in my district and across the country are facing barriers in accessing the critical services they need. From struggling with physical infrastructure at VA facilities to navigating the red tape and the benefits process, disabled veterans are getting left behind. Doorways are too narrow, elevators that are constantly out of service, and exam rooms that aren't big enough to accommodate wheelchairs are just a few of the obstacles veterans face when trying to receive care. Serving disabled veterans is a critical part of the VA's mission, but they need to do more to ensure unique needs of disabled veterans are being heard. By establishing a permanent advisory committee within the VA, this bill ensures disabled veterans have a seat at the table in providing feedback so they can easily access the benefits, services, and facilities they've earned. We cannot leave our disabled veterans behind. I urge all members of this committee to support this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Valadeo. The panel is now excused from the witness table. And let's see, thank you again to our witnesses for being here today. I ask unanimous consent that all members shall have 5 legislative days in which to revise and extend their remarks and include any extraneous material. Hearing no objection, so ordered. This hearing is now adjourned.